Thank you. All right, now with the housekeeping remarks, I would like to turn this over to Kat Gitzbach. Kat?
Hi, Julie, or thanks, Julie, and welcome everyone. For those of you who would like to, please put any introductions into the chat. Let us know who you are. We're very much looking forward to this discussion. If you have any questions during the meeting, feel free to put them into the chat. When we do open it up for questions, please raise your hand and our moderators will call on you. If you have any additional follow-up, we'll be putting links to connect further with the Legal Preparedness Action Package into the chat. And now I'll go ahead and turn it over to our moderators, Elizabeth and Deb. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm so glad everybody is here participating today, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the GHSA Legal Preparedness Package. My name is Liz Sadov, and Deb Yeski, Dr. Deborah Yeski, who also you see on the screen, and I co-lead the Action Package's Regulatory Subworking Group, and we're moderating today's session. Just by way of introduction, I wear two hats. I am co-moderating for the Department of Health and Human Services, but my home agency is the Food and Drug Administration, where I focus on facilitating the development and availability of medical countermeasures. We wanted to express our appreciation to the speakers for your dedicated time and participation, recognizing you were still in an active MPOX response and being pulled in many directions. The Legal Preparedness Action Package was established to address the lack of awareness about important roles that laws at all levels, country, regional, and international, play in operationalizing core public health capacities for public health emergencies. Its mission is to promote legal preparedness as a critical capacity for an effective response and strengthening global health security overall. Before the action package was established, there was no multi-sectoral platform that advocated for legal preparedness to facilitate the type of exchange of experiences from around the world and across sectors, such as today's discussion on various aspects of regulatory preparedness. We've seen countries experience challenges in accessing medical countermeasures for infectious disease breaks. There are many reasons for this, not all of which are legal or regulatory. However, challenges that stem from inadequate laws and regulations can be addressed prior to an emergency. Countries that need to invest energy and resources to ensure that legal capacities already exist, have been tested, and potential issues that have been resolved before emergencies occur. This frees up efforts to focus on the overwhelming scientific, public health, medical, political, fiscal, logistical, and communication dimensions of the response. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to develop appropriate legal measures in the middle of an emergency. Regulatory preparedness is the capability to map, develop, refine, and utilize regulatory instruments to enable development and availability of medical countermeasures. And by that, I'm referring to therapeutics, vaccines, including devices and including diagnostics, to prevent and detect and respond to infectious disease threats. This means having regulatory mechanisms that enable the review and assessment when in an emergency, rapid authorization or approval of needed medical countermeasures, as well as the legal mechanisms that enable continued monitoring and safety. Some of the key regulatory mechanisms that facilitate access to medical countermeasures are emergency use authorization, expanded access mechanisms, such as the World Health Organization's MURI protocols, reliance and recognition, as well as the World Health Organization's pre-qualification and emergency use listing processes. The Regulatory Subworking Group has been working on framing these issues for a long time, and the MPOX impacted countries are now beginning to access medical countermeasures almost 2 years into the response efforts. Specifically, one of the things we're working on is developing an issue brief that describes these regulatory topics to contribute toward regulatory capacity building efforts that may facilitate more fair and equitable global access to medical countermeasures in future public health emergencies. We thought it is important to start this dialogue using this platform for everyone to hear key stakeholders to begin to understand lessons from the MPOX outbreaks and to inform our work and future efforts so that we can do better next time as a country, a region, and the world. This is one of the ways GHSA helps strengthen our preparedness as a global community. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Mabratu Maseva. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, colleagues, and a good morning, good afternoon from where I am. It's a great pleasure today to be with this team. I'm very glad as a current chair of GHSA work, and I'm also very grateful with the legal the action package teams on organizing this wonderful meeting today, and very much timely on issues which I think very related with the struggles that we are having as a community of practice in especially global south. So I think with very able panelists that we are having today, and also the continuous work of GHSA action package, I think we believe that this will help all of us on at least understanding the landscape and working for the landscape to improve our regulatory system, and also going forward, it will enable us on multiple areas that we need to improve. So I'm very much happy to congratulate the success of this meeting, and I hope also it will be the start point for all of us to see how countries are experiencing on the real time of pandemics and epidemics. I personally, as previously coordinating national COVID task force, we are very much suffered in the early days of the vaccine production. So we don't have a system set for liability mechanisms, approval systems, and in the middle of the biggest crisis that the world is facing. Imagine how much it will be difficult for all of us to be on that position and the leading. So let me give you just one example that in my tenure that I was requested by more than 100,000 pages in front of my desk asking for the vaccine, but my NITAG was not able to approve the request that we had on the pipeline. So it's just everyone's personal experience. That's why we really wanted the GHSA platform as a voluntary organization which will help the countries. So, you know, GHSA is created by 2024 Ebola crisis in West Africa, which strengthened the outbreak implementation of international health regulation, and we have made great strides in promoting capacity building towards a world safer and secure from global health threats posed by infectious diseases. So after our experience of working alone will not yield anything going forward for us, Ethiopia was like voluntary to contribute human workforce for Ebola response at that time, and also worked to formulate the Africa CDC as one of the health security agency in Africa as a pillar for collaborative works as we go forward. So GHSA is like served as an incubator of innovative approach, as you see today, to address global health security challenge. And also it is helping us to elevate the capacities like legal preparedness. So in our chairmanship in 2024, one of the ideas we presented is to push forward the agenda of legal preparedness and sustainable financing as a core objective. And we are very thankful of the scholars, the institutions, individuals working to make this knowledge product globally important. So I think that the legal action package will be launching a legal mapping tool in coming year to help countries, especially it will help countries like Ethiopia who are really in need of reforming their legal preparedness action package. The regulatory challenge experienced by countries, as I said, during COVID-19, MPOX also recently shown us the greater awareness is very much important. As we speak, in INB, in WHO, member states are debating on how best we can formulate a legal preparedness for regulatory and also for related issues, which will help the global arena to focus on legal tools and the comprehensive preparedness in the future. Essentially, if we are legally prepared, we can save time during public health emergencies. By ensuring that legal capacities are in place, we can focus on our efforts on other critical dimensions of the response. So the most important thing for legal preparedness, in my perspective, is working in the peacetime. There is no peacetime, but at least we have somehow integrated the COVID response, and we are trying to respond for outbreaks like MPOX and also recent Marburg in Rwanda. So we come together in webinar with experts from different sectors and parts of the world who have kindly agreed to share their experience with all of us. That's great, really. I'm very much grateful again. What we hear today will help our efforts. If we want to save more lives every time we are faced with the health emergencies, we need to establish a solid foundation for legal preparedness beforehand. We cannot wait until we are in the middle of the emergency. That's a crisis time, and it's very difficult to have a legal consultation and sound legal tool as we go. There are exciting opportunities ahead for us, from defining the field itself to holding public events to bring greater awareness, and to creating opportunity to engage with the help and engage and help countries build the legal preparedness. Together through this work, we can trigger greater interest and work to support countries in becoming more legally prepared. So this is one of a very much important thing and a very much close to my heart activity. Thank you so much for your good introduction. Back to you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I'll take over from here. Thank you very much for those remarks. And I just kind of want to reiterate what was said earlier. We know that a lot of our colleagues that are in this space are busy with this current public health emergency. And so we think that this is timely to have this dialogue today, even though we don't have everyone. We are recording it, like Laura said earlier. We think that it's really important to start this conversation. So this is not going to be a one and done. This is going to be, we will continue this conversation when we can get all of the stakeholders around the table, to chip in and to talk about what we need to do. Like Bharat said, that there's really never a peacetime, but there could be a quiet time where we can all start, to continue this conversation. So with that, I also want to say, I'm Deb Yeski. I'm the Global Regulatory Policy and Intelligence Lead at CEPI, and have the honor of being a co-chair of the regulatory sub-working group in this legal action package with Liz. And to that end, CEPI
is a coalition that brings a lot of different stakeholders together. And in this regard, being the facilitator of a meeting like this and bringing stakeholders to the table is my role here in facilitating this conversation. So with that, we can go ahead and move along in the agenda. And I would like to invite Dr. Makumbo from Uganda to the virtual table and to start the conversation. And what Liz and I will do is we have different sections of the agenda, as you saw, as we're starting locally, we're going to regional, and then we'll go to global, and then we have some remarks by industry at the end, and then we'll close with we'll start to close with questions and answers from you all in the audience, and then we'll wrap up. So I guess thank you, Dr. Makumbe, for taking time out of what must be a very busy day for you, as I understand cases of MPOX are increasing in your country. And I do understand that you now have some vaccine allocated to you, which is fantastic. But I was wondering if you could just maybe reflect on as you're living it, and as it was building up to getting the regulatory mechanism in Uganda authorized or approved, and then vaccine in country. Can you reflect on any regulatory challenges with those activities in this recent, of course, as we know, MPOX has been going on for a while, 2022 with a different clade, and then of course this emergency is with clade 1B mostly. And so I just wanted to see if you can highlight or reflect any regulatory challenges that you've seen from the Uganda perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. First of all, you are right. This is not peacetime for us, because the cases are doubling every 14 days, and the trajectory is still going up. So really, it's a hard time for us. It's not peacetime. However, one of the things which in the space of regulatory in accessing products for, by the way, I define the regulatory MPOX response as policies, regulations, procedures, standards that impede us from accessing these life-saving products, in terms of vaccine, diagnostics, or treatment. So one of the things in my country is that we really don't have a standard emergency use authorization framework. So every time something which can save life is available, the process kind of delays, and in emergency, speed saves life, and of course economy. So it's important that these structures are already, or these frameworks or instruments are in place. For example, that EAU really takes time, because the National Drug Authority, which authorizes, has to request for dossiers, which sometimes they take time to arrive, but then they have to review those, and then maybe even ask questions. So really, that process, it really creates a delay which can save 1 or 2 lives, if not 10. So that's why I'm very happy that this action package is in place to prepare us, to make sure that all of us really, when such thing happens, these illegal instruments are in place to help us, facilitate us, respond, spontaneously. And of course, law and public health, if you want to, and lack of word, they are really great partners. Without a law, you cannot really do anything you want. You must do everything. You must respond within a regulatory framework, a law, an act. So it is important that these these instruments are there to facilitate us to respond properly. So the other thing really is the delay in regulatory, delay, because sometimes different countries have processes they go through. Although WHO, sometimes we depend so much on WHO, once WHO has pre-qualified or advised, we take that with a pinch of salt, but the country also wants to go through its own processes, and that takes time. But if a country is well established, they have well-established instruments, I think that can help a lot. Maybe the other thing is, which also is really, we are living, is the supply chain, manufacturing and distribution. This really is because the stocks are constricted, and this really is really challenging for us. And I think really we need to prepare on how we can really make sure that the supply chain is, it flows smoothly and in a speedily manner. But the supply chain, manufacturing and distribution is a bit slow, So that also is a challenge to us. Sometimes all these instruments, in case they are not there, what we do, and I can give you an example in Ebola, we issued, what we call statutory instruments, so that whatever we are doing really is within the law. So that's the way, it's a measure, which is really not permanent. It's just, just to go over that period. It's a measure which is really not permanent. These statutory instruments, which the minister can issue, so that we are implementing in a manner which is legally. So those are some of the things, but maybe the other fear we have now is criminalizing. These laws which criminalize, they push away people from coming out to, to come and access services or access these products. So if you criminalize a certain, a group of people, that is also something which you can delay access to these products. And of course, again, stigma is one of the things. Again, stigma, drives away people. They go underground. So we also need such instruments to help us, so that this stigma does not really stand in the way for people to access, these products. So to me, that's really is one of the things we are living, because why are we doubling? Why are cases doubling? Maybe stigma, maybe criminalizing, people are hiding, so you can see that's what we are living in. I thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for the opportunity. And I thank the legal package. I think it will go to help us to prepare better.
Yeah.
I submit, Chair.
Thank you so much. I guess, can I just ask a couple of questions? So if you don't have the emergency mechanism in place, the EUA, did you, in this instance, did you rely on WHO's PQ to allow the use of the vaccine?
Very right. We rely on WHO. Yeah, we do. We trust WHO. Yeah.
Okay, and then are you in the process of well, not maybe right now, but do you have plans to start to look at putting the emergency use provisions within your regulations and legislation?
Positively, and I'm sure the legal package is going to help us. I don't know whether they have done some inventory of countries which need help, and I think we are one of them.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points. I mean, I think, the supply chain and the manufacturing, I realize that currently, all of the doses that are, and maybe we'll get into this in the next section for the regional, were donations from different stakeholders, countries, organizations. So supply chain and manufacturing definitely are important when we look also at, you know, the end-to-end supply chain, you know, as a whole. So thank you very much.
We are looking forward for the legal, this package to help us. Things like clinical trials. You know, clinical trials also take time. We need to have instruments which are ready-made there. We just tweak here and there, and we do clinical trials, and then the product is available. But if the clinical trial process is so long, it denies people from useful products. So we are really hopeful that this package will help us to overcome such challenges.
Wonderful. Yes. Well, that's why we're here. So thank you so much. So I think we will move on. I think we're ahead of schedule, but
No, we want to introduce the Mexican.
oh, okay. Okay. I don't have that on my agenda.
Okay, next we're going to hear from Naomi Serena Sanchez. If you're on the line.
Morning,
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
the invitation. I'm gonna speak in Spanish, please, because it's more easy for me.
Thank you. I will switch the translation services.
Sí, sí, sí. Yes.
Please go ahead.
Nosotros en México actualmente contamos con diversas vías regulatorias para la autorización de nuevos registros. Entre ellas tenemos una vía tradicional de autorización, pero también tenemos una vía de autorización por emergencia, así como la vía por acuerdos de equivalencia. Nosotros en la vía, en los acuerdos de equivalencia, tomamos muy en cuenta las autorizaciones previas de otras agencias como EMA, FDA, principalmente en las cuestiones de seguridad, calidad y eficacia, que es lo que tenemos que garantizar a nuestra población. Sin embargo, también solicitamos cierto tipo de información regional que para nosotros es muy importante que dé cumplimiento el fabricante, para nosotros poder cerciorarnos de que realmente estamos teniendo un producto que, pues, no obstante, sabemos que estamos utilizando por una emergencia que es inmediata. Necesitamos garantizar también a nuestra población que una vez que hayan adquirido ese medicamento, vacuna, principalmente vacunas, ahorita que hemos tenido estas últimas emergencias por COVID, y más recientemente la emergencia por MPOX, tenemos que garantizar, ¿no?, que posteriormente pues ellos sigan manteniendo su salud, ¿no? Entonces, principalmente es eso lo que nosotros evaluamos. En México, los procesos vigentes de regulación o de autorización, perdón, que se basan en acuerdos de equivalencia, no incluyen a los medicamentos o vacunas precalificados por la OMS, porque nos tomamos, digamos que, pues, el derecho, ¿no?, de poder nosotros hacer nuestra propia evaluación, que en general estamos bastante homologados, ¿no?, con los procesos de la EMA, con los procesos de la OMS. Entonces, básicamente sería únicamente como dar un segundo vistazo, ¿no?, a estos productos, aunque ya hayan sido precalificados. Perdón, me perdí un poquito. Y bueno, sabemos que pues podemos tener un poco de discrepancias regulatorias con respecto a las agencias pues más reconocidas a nivel mundial. Sin embargo, Sabemos que requerimos actualizar tanto nuestro marco regulatorio como nuestros procesos al interior de la agencia y realmente estamos trabajando en ello, ¿no? Con las homologaciones para poder lograr obtener registros, digamos, con mayor celeridad que cuando seguimos un proceso tradicional un proceso tradicional regulatorio dentro de nuestra agencia, que a veces puede llevar un tiempo largo. Sin embargo, al acelerar nuestros procesos, no significa que estemos demeritando nosotros en la calidad de la evaluación de los productos que estamos analizando. Considero que es necesario trabajar a nivel regional sobre la convergencia regulatoria enfocada en situaciones de emergencia como las pandemias, por ejemplo, para poder disminuir los tiempos de aprobación de los medicamentos y así facilitar con ello el acceso oportuno a medicamentos y vacunas. Este proceso puede incluir a los acuerdos de equivalencia que sean ya tal cual reconocidos para otorgar los registros de manera acelerada de vacunas y otros medicamentos cuando la demanda de ellos nos esté exigiendo a nosotros una liberación acelerada al mercado, porque finalmente no podemos prolongar tiempos de autorización por simples asuntos administrativos o alguna mejora regulatoria que podría hacerse previamente. No podríamos detener por eso el acceso a nuestra población a las vacunas y otros medicamentos.
Having trouble getting off mute. Thank you very much for your remarks. And it is true, different mechanisms to get to where you need to be at the end of the day, whether it's locally, your own local authorization or approval, or relying on WHO or other regulatory agencies that have made that assessment already. Later, we'll hear from Marco Cavalieri from EMA on just that. But I think as even I mentioned earlier about the end-to-end with supply chain, I think it's important to also look at end-to-end from making sure mechanisms are in countries that are either local approvals or reliance, but even, as we've seen in the number of, emerging infectious diseases, even with COVID, we've had to do studies in countries that have cases. It also, the idea to look at the end-to-end once it's in country too, that sometimes with doing studies, getting clinical trial agreements through the regulatory agency, as well as through ethics committees, seeing that, speed saves lives, right? So the idea too is to make sure that those activities aren't, being done sequentially, that they can be done in parallel to speed up, making sure that clinical trials can be done quickly rather than waiting on any one entity to, approve one of the protocols. So I think it's, and that's why this is so, this topic and the legal action package and the regulatory piece within the action package is very important to identify those bottlenecks and those challenges to help countries and to, even identify maybe things that weren't even thought of at the time. So I appreciate the remarks from both Naomi and from Isa. And we're taking questions at the end, right? Group, yeah. So we'll just go ahead and stop there. Liz, do you want to chip in at all here?
No, I appreciated your remarks in terms of benefit of having the types of agreements in place in advance, the effort that you described in terms of reliance, the need to think about that and not yes, each country in your country in making its own assessments, but also recognizing when it's important to be able to rely on the assessments of others. I think I heard that within your comments, so I appreciate hearing that. So no, I think if you want to go ahead and move to the regional component, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. So in the regional aspects or section of the agenda, we have representatives from Africa CDC, AVRF, and the Pan American Health Organization. So if those individuals can come online, that would be great, or on camera. So I think I will start with, I'm not sure if Dr. Temfek is on from Africa CDC or Dr. Falah. Is anyone on from Africa CDC? Okay, well, we can take some time. Maybe they're just late joining. So I'll start with Dr. Nyarko. Thank you for joining from AVRF. I guess as you can see, the gist of our conversations today are about regulatory challenges, and I was wondering if you could just maybe outline for the group the AVRF process that you go through to help countries review certain either protocols or assessment reports from other medicines regulatory agencies to allow for then authorization or approval within those countries that are participating in that review.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, good day to everyone. Yes, the AVRF process actually was used for the MPOX. In this situation, AVRF has a multi-country joint review process because we were following sort of the progression of the outbreak. We had actually, and this was following the AVRF procedure, contacted the 14 high-risk countries at the time, probably sometime in August or so, and they had nominated reviewers, both ethics committee reviewers and regulatory reviewers from the NRA. Essentially, the process is we do get reviewers from all the countries. Fortunately, the manufacturer, Bavarian Nordic, was also already willing to work with us, provided us with information that we needed to be reviewed. The European Medicines Agency, as well as the US FDA, also provided some information. And by using the AVRF process, we got all the reviewers together and we did a joint review. This joint review, while it was ongoing, we also had the pre-qualification. So we started the review before the pre-qualification. The review, it took about 15 working days. That's close, 15 days to get the review done, just because of the support that we had. We came up with a review report that the countries used to make their emergency use authorization decisions. We've started tracking that information of the 14 countries. I believe now we have about 8 or 9 that already have the EUA in process. So from what I see, the issue is not so much regulatory, but really about how the regulations that exist are being interpreted and being used, and also whether people actually even know their own regulations. under emergency use, in situations like what we have, it's very clear that this is not when anyone is going to be making any regulations. We did have the COVID outbreak not long ago that we used some of these mechanisms. So the mechanisms exist in most of the countries. We find that in some countries, after the decision, after we've done the assessment, I believe some countries go back, and this was mentioned by a colleague from Uganda, where they try to probably do the review again or submit it to another. And some countries actually deal with this emergency as if it's a regular submission. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we see happening. And that is really, I think, an interpretation on how to use these regulations during emergencies. So maybe in your package, some information on interpretation and use and application would be helpful. I would rest my comments here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosi. I appreciate your remarks. I just have a question, and maybe you kind of touched on this, but you had mentioned, and we know that the review, the ABRF review had started before the PQ was approved or enacted. So what happens, or what could happen if that happens again? I mean, why didn't it just, I mean, is it because the review had already started that you didn't, then all of the countries just defer to the PQ, or, how does that work?
So typically, I mean, as you know, typically when a PQ is done, the PQ is not a regulatory decision. PQ is some assessment for countries to actually use as the basis for their regulatory decision. So even in the past, when we had situations like this for facilitated authorizations that we do to support this, we sometimes actually started with the PQ assessment to enable countries to go through and for the PQ folks to explain so that the decisions can be made fairly quickly. In this situation, because when the outbreak started, the PQ had not started, we did have a meeting with the countries and the DGs, and they were interested in actually proceeding in getting them to do their own reviews for the information that existed. And actually, there was information from the EMA, information from the FDA. They provided that information. The company provided any data that was required. In addition to that, we had countries like Nigeria and DRC that had also already approved it. So all these resources available enabled the regulators at the table to actually go through and make their own decision. And definitely, as you know, in this case, this product is being used in Europe, it's been used. So, the issue really is the fact that there's not much African data, but in terms of safety, that was there. And so it's not so much, I think it's just them having more information to deal with. And at the end of the day, it's reassuring that all these things lined up and it came. I don't see them as opposing each other, or if anything, it sort of helps. But it's also encouraging that the countries, even in spite of not having the PQ decision, wanted to go ahead and start doing their own review. And they did the review. And this also speaks to the capacity building that has been done and continues to be done, and the increasing work that is being done with the preparation of the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, coming of African Medicines Agency. As you know, we do have quite a number of actors doing various capacity building, including ourselves, and this all points to that.
No, I agree. And I think that, giving the information to everyone so they can make those decisions is very important, and really, applaud the support that other agencies like EMA and FDA have helped, and, you know, to give them that information to help them, you know, make that the final decision for themselves. Have all countries now authorized that were in a part of the review? Do you know?
We have about two or three countries that haven't authorized them as yet. But in those countries, they probably, the pandemic, the outbreak is not active there. But for those that need it, they have activated. They continue to, and we are providing weekly updates. But this also points to, in my opinion, having a lot of education on emergency use authorizations. Emergency use authorizations are not regular authorizations. They are not, you know, your regular pathway. And in fact, after if the emergency is, you know, not declared anymore, all these authorizations kind of die in their tracks. They can't even be used. And somehow I find that countries are going into using, you know, treating them as if these are regular authorizations. These are conditional authorizations. And I think that you know, probably we need to educate on that. Because technically for countries that really need to use it, they just need to trust and kind of go ahead and use it because it's an emergency. And that's sort of, you know, so this, most countries are going to require safety, quality, efficacy information to make that decision. That data is not usually there 100% in these instances. Therefore, I think a lot of work needs to be done into explaining what it is, what we're doing. And a lot of this also comes with actually collecting information. So for now, part of the condition is really collecting the effectiveness data that is needed to support and to build the safety profile. And so for me, I think it's really educating on that, providing resources for capacity building so that folks can use the instruments that they have effectively. And of course, for those that do not have the instruments, you know, do it, modify it. We do have guidelines. We have guidance documents, AVRF, for emergency preparedness and use and registrations. It's all there. There are documents and guidelines there that folks can use, can adapt to their national situations. And probably we need to talk about this more. Maybe after the event, there could be some kind of lessons learned, or where there were irritants and how they can be addressed and shared also, so that you know, these best practices can be built into the systems as we go.
I mean, I think that what you're saying is really hitting the nail on the head. I think that, you know, interpreting the legislation or that they have already, you know, coming into this, having this, let's just use this instance for an example, the Bavarian Nordic vaccine is approved by a number of, you know, a number of regulatory authorities from years ago. Now, granted, not in the African region, and I understand that. But so there's nuances, right? So there's nuances that you have, you know, an already approved product, and quickly to do an emergency use is what I'm hearing, that maybe a lot of the countries through the review did emergency uses, and then having, after, you know, the dust settles and things of that nature, then converting that to a full approval. I know, for instance, FDA still has some EUAs on the books. Not anymore. I don't know. I'm looking at Liz, but anyway, but had to convert them, right?
We do for certain uses that are considered off-label. Yes.
Because that data isn't there to support, you know, the full approval. So, you know, but then the difference for, you know, for maybe in different instances, having products that even don't have the full approvals coming from one of the other agencies, like, well, EMA has conditional marketing authorizations, which are real marketing authorizations and not emergency use. So there are a lot of nuances here to, you know, pull back the onion, but that is very interesting. And I think that if if you guys, if AVRF is doing a lessons learned, or if there's a lessons learned in this respect, I think the legal action package would love to be a part of that, and to understand where, you know, where the legal action package can help either interpret regs, legislation that's already there, educate, and talk about, you know, the transition from an EUA to a full approval, and the like. Would be very amenable to be a part of that. Liz?
Just would like to ask if you know whether a lot of these EUA legal frameworks rely on the need for there to be a FIIC in place or a declaration. Are they tied to it? And just to reaffirm what Deb said, this is an area
Yeah,
that I think we can help quite a bit with.
Yeah, so two things. I mean, for an EUA or EUL to be in place, yes, you need an emergency to be declared. Technically, for most regulatory agencies are going to require that. Why? Because typically products that are PQ'd with a full set of information to ensure that they are okay, they meet the standards. But in a situation where they do not meet the standards, there has to be some extenuating circumstances such as an emergency. And this is part of the reason why there was that slowdown. So yes, but whether the countries have in their regulations this, I'm not sure, because the regulatory frameworks for a lot of countries differ. In some countries, a conditional approval is actually not even an approval, because the regulation either have approved or not approved. So the middle there is a policy decision that folks can work on. Let me give you a real example in the African context here. In most countries, they want a sponsor to file an application to say, I want this product approved. Under the emergency use, Bavarian Nordic did not file any application in any of the countries because it's an emergency. It needs to be used. The ministry wants it. So this was one of the hurdles that we found where, you know, product has to be used. Sponsor is not necessarily interested in actually filing for the product to be authorized because the product is probably not going to be used for regular routine emergencies. So you could see the dilemma that this caused. And in DRC, when we were doing this in June-ish, ultimately it was the Ministry of Health that had to, you know, do the filing and for the process to start. Recently now, no, countries are, you know, so we are educating. They are also realizing that, yes, this may be used in, you know, and the manufacturer has said, yes, if the country is interested in adding this for regular routine use, we'll be happy to file. But you see, so I think what needs to happen around this is really the explanation and for folks to understand, you know, how the regulations are interpreted. And it's very different for each of that. Africa is fairly complex. We have, you know, those following the English law, those following the French law, those following the Portuguese stuff. So we have all those and the interpretations as well. So I think this is a frontier that we need to deal with. From AVRF's point of view, yes, we will be happy to work with folks on that because it's part of capacity building. It's not stuff that we have done really in the past. When AVRF started years ago, there was sort of a model law to help countries to pick up the law thing. But definitely we'll be interested in discussing this and seeing what we can do to shed some more light on this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yep. Lots here to delve into. So thank you a lot, Kwasi. I appreciate your candor and your remarks. So I think if there are no other questions from Liz, we'll turn to our representative from PAHO, Murat. So I just I realized that you're part of the supply chain revolving fund access to vaccines. I'm just wondering if you can reflect or outline maybe challenges that you have encountered on access to vaccines during an emergency or public health emergency, and what the limitations and the regulation, any regulatory issues that you have experienced in that regard.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Greetings, colleagues. First, I want to give a brief background on the PAHO Revolving Fund for Access to Vaccine, because I don't want to assume everyone knows about it. So this is a special cooperation mechanism in the region of Americas. Mainly 42 Latin American and Caribbean countries are part of it. And it's established by a resolution by our member states in 1979. And for more than 44 years, we have been procuring vaccines. All kinds of vaccines to our member states is a routine procurement. And one important thing, we are talking about peace times and emergency times. For countries to be able to have a healthy access to vaccines, they need to have established regular routine systems for the peace times. And this is one of the power of the revolving funds, that we are continuously working with them and continuously educating them. Because as Dr. Yarko indicating, sometimes nation officers, they might not be aware of their own regulations. I have a chance to work in many other regions like Middle East, Western Pacific. Unfortunately, that used to be the case. For PAHO, since the revolving fund grew as an organic part of the immunization programs. I want to remind that the immunization resolution, EPA resolution, was taken in 1974. And then just from the infancy times, PAHO Revolving Fund became an organic part of their access to vaccines. So basically, our routine engagement with them, our routine business, help these countries to access to whatever they need in the time of the emergency as well. Very tangible example, PAHO Revolving Fund, for instance, we are relying on WHO pre-qualification. And we are aligning all our member states to recognize WHO pre-qualification and other measures. For instance, if a product is not WHO pre-qualified, we are relying on strengthened regulatory agencies. And we have a specific unit focusing on that, assessing products based on the decision of the strong regulatory agencies if there is no WHO pre-qualification, and also helps countries to take customized decisions if they have any questions. For the case of MPOX, for instance, in 2022, we were able to access the vaccines, and we were the only UN agency that could procure the vaccine without emergency use authorization, because we conducted the analysis based on a FDA and EMA approval, and the product was available. So, but we have a routine engagement with the regulatory people in the countries, and our engagement with them not from emergency, because we shouldn't forget that nation officers also, they have a high rotation. You might educate someone now, and by the time there is a next emergency, that person most likely to be replaced. So this routine engagement and focused engagement for each country is necessity. And also the routine system to be in place is important from the supplier perspective as well, because we are just being lucky for a vaccine to be available for MPOX because of the US government's smallpox vaccine position. Basically, US government, and we are very thankful to including this effort and overall efforts to the US government, globally and regionally. For instance, they were sustaining Bavarian Nordic. And the production lines, the vaccine knowledge was kept warm. And by the time now there is this MPOX pandemic, we have access globally thanks to that effort, thanks to that positioning. So the routine systems not only to be in place for the countries, but at the supplier side. And then also the global regulatory functioning, and then the recent EUL approval was very critical in that regard. So my number one thesis is like the routine systems should be strengthening, not only emergency customized approach. And this is the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I am seeing some veteran colleagues from the COVID pandemic response like Hannah and then Dr. Brown, etc. So, and during the COVID pandemic, what we learned also the importance of end-to-end holistic supply chain design approaches, because regulatory issues, the legal issues is multidimensional. For instance, if a vaccine which is available is not insured for adverse event, then countries are required to provide indemnity and liability provisions. With COVID, COVAX, advanced market commitment eligible countries, we were able to establish a scheme for that. But for self-financing countries, each self-financing country, they have to come up with their own scheme, which created some hurdles in some countries. Because, some countries, they choose to get waivers from the people who get vaccinated. And then that created vaccine hesitancy. And we have other tangible regulatory hurdles. For example, many times we had to extend the shelf life. And if the regulatory authority's decision to extend the shelf life is not very well communicated with the healthcare workers, then many people in these countries, they have the perception that they are given expired vaccines, which was not the case. So that is why I want to really stress to end-to-end supply chain design very well connected to the regulatory decision making. And that was my second thesis. And then the third one, customized approaches, is very important for each country. As Dr. Yarko explaining, each African country is different, each Latin American country is different, all around the world, each country is different. Regardless of the income level, an average country, they always think that they have the best system and others should be aligned with them, unfortunately. And there is some kind of a professional hubris around it. And how do we overcome that? And what is the optimal level of contact to find the common ground with the global decision making, with the suppliers, and the national decision making? I can say that based on the power experience, the regional effort is very valuable for that, because regions are the optimal touch point connected the global decision making with the customized country approach. But the regional offices should be always, has a sustainable staff, dedicated focus on that, not only for the emergencies, but also for the routine vaccines and routine interventions. And the sustainability and appropriate staffing is key. Otherwise, we will be facing the same problems during every emergency. And I want to conclude my remarks to special thanks to this initiative and the US government's overall efforts. During the COVID-19 pandemic, that's vaccine donations and overall coordination support was a life-saving for us. And then what you are doing now is a life-saving for the future. So many thanks for bringing us together today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's so much that you said that was fantastic. I mean, I recall when we heard that PAHO was able to procure the Bavarian Nordic vaccine back in 2022, and thought that that was, very good, example of, what you have been doing for years. And, kudos to you all for doing that and looking at that and being an example from, for maybe some other countries getting online to do that. I do think that, this whole looking at the supply chain, education, we've talked about the, Kwasi talked about the education piece, and so did, Dr. Makumbi, talking about the education, when products expire, but then, we can shelf life extend them, and, for folks to know, or the citizens of those countries to know that, you're not getting bad products, that, these products were made in through GMP, quality, we're, because of the data, we are allowed, we can see that the product is still good for, set time, and that you're not being experimented on. And we've heard the gambit, of course, through what we saw during COVID with, magnets being in vaccines and things of that nature. So I do think that, there is a whole host of things that, and the regional piece, I think is really important. I think it's important to start to, and at CEPI, we're looking at, of course, regulatory preparedness and what the give and takes are during an emergency. Everybody wants to be, have their system, like you said, their system is best, but at the time of an emergency, some of those things, they don't go by the wayside, but I think you have to fall into, conformance, with the, with what to do to get vaccines or products to the people that need them to save lives. And so, the harmonization of regulatory requirements, it all came, it did all start to happen in COVID, and I think that unfortunately it took a global pandemic to realize, and I think regulators and folks in government saw that the harmonization helps everybody, and not to be, and I don't want to be pejorative and say that the sticklers for like, well, I want to do it my way. There's a time and a place for that, but it's not during an emergency. And so Liz mentioned our brief that we're working on, that touches upon that as well, and we'd love to share it with this group. And again, at CEPI, we're working on different innovations to help with information equity, which we think leads to equitable access to products during an emergency. So there are a lot of things that are bubbling under of what everybody has talked to today. And again, I'm very excited and energized that this is not the only conversation that we're going to have, that we're going to continue this dialogue and this engagement. I want to say it's going to be more than a conversation. It'll be an engagement where the legal action package can, do what we can to help, making sure that those provisions are in regulations and legislation, and to help interpret them and to educate. So, Liz, anything to add before I turn to you?
I would just pick up on the thread that you brought to us about the touch point between needing to have the regional involvement in the routine traditional product world. I don't know how best to say that. To really facilitate the ability to have emergency use mechanisms that are trusted and flex and provide the needed the support that you're describing. And the intersection of that with each country's unique needs, their systems, their sovereignty, I do think this is an area that I think the regulation, as you said, sort of crosses the end-to-end components of this. And as you see with the MPOX is a great example of where you have approved products, you have the ability to have those systems, yet there are uses and things that expiration, things that require emergency considerations, information considerations, that each country will have to be able to inform and be engaged with their own populations in their own unique ways. So I think this is a really critical point of how is it that we can provide those tools that you think can facilitate these efforts. And really understand at the working with not just vaccines, diagnostics. You know, I know you're involved in the vaccine solely, but this area, and we'll hear later from a diagnostic representative, I do think how we engage in it in our non-emergency ways is critical to our ability to be able to do so during emergencies. So I appreciate hearing your considerations of that more as we advance these efforts.
Wonderful. I guess if there are no other remarks from the first two, the Dr. McCumbee or Quasi or Meerkat, we can move on to the global perspective, and I'll hand it over to Liz.
Okay, and I am going to continue to rely on Deb to ask questions and frame some of the conversations, but now we have three speakers here who have joined us who will help us bring this global perspective. We have, I guess I'll introduce all three if you want to go online and make it a little bit of an interactive conversation, but we'll start with Dr. Hannah Kettler with the Gavi Alliance, and then we have Dr. Adam Hacker from CEPI, and we have Dr. Marco Cavalieri from the EMA, European Medicines Agency, each of whom played an integral part of this whole vaccine story. So it's going to be a vaccine-focused conversation. And really, I want to give each one of you, we'll start in that order, an opportunity, if you could, from your perspectives, to just describe your perspective of what this happened at the beginning, let's say, of the MPOX outbreak, what the legal challenges have been, your roles within helping to get us where we are today and getting the vaccines in country, and now rolling out vaccine campaigns. So thank you for joining us, and I guess we'll start with Dr. Kettler.
Hi, hello everyone. Happy whatever day is Wednesday, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's good to be here, and yeah, I really appreciate. I hope we have a chance to also come back to some of the regional points that were brought up on the previous panel, because I think at least for Gavi specifically, one of the characteristics of this outbreak contrasted with COVID to some degree was the co-leadership, if you will, between the global and WHO and Africa CDC in particular, and just sort of identifying roles and responsibilities and operating in a very rapidly evolving ecosystem has meant challenges as well as opportunities, and how quickly, I would say, I observed from how we worked in COVID to how we're working in MPOX and some of the important lessons there. Just very quickly, from Gavi's perspective, many of you know the Gavi Alliance, a well-established organization focused specifically on making available affordable and accessible vaccines equitably, with a focus on the poorest countries in the world. Our core program is primarily focused on routine immunization, although we do have a sizable portfolio also of outbreak preventable diseases. We support stockpiles for yellow fever, for cholera, for Ebola, and so have experience and teams that are used to working the interface between the routine and the outbreak. And I think Murat's point around the sustainability of the routine being critical, as well as, and the lessons learned from COVID weren't that far behind when MPOX came up. And so I think many of us have been able to benefit quite literally from the network still being primarily functioning between PAHO and CEPI and WHO and UNICEF, as we all started to build out our response plans for MPOX. For Gavi in particular, already in the beginning of 2024, as we were preparing for our board mid-year, we were, as we watched the cases escalating, especially in the DRC, and there was already quite an active discussion, again, between vaccine partners as well as with donors and other agencies around potential roles and responsibilities. Gavi identified a number of places where we could potentially contribute, primarily focused on making access the vaccines as quickly as possible, as well as supporting the countries in their preparedness and their planning, and ultimately the delivery of vaccines as part of their broader response planning. At the time of the board in June, again, this is still ahead of the fake declaration of the effects declaration. It's ahead of pre-qualification. We did at the time get approval both to look into a learning agenda and the roles we might play medium term in MPOX, the approval to look at establishing a stockpile for the medium term, but also for the response at hand, to look at our role potentially facilitating donations and, subject to pre-qualification, looking at the potential for procurement. I think, partly significantly building out from the lesson from COVID about how critical early access to funding was. We had also, as an organization, been working on something called the First Response Fund, to have, readily available capital at the point at which a grade 2-3 emergency or fake is declared. So those are the triggers that are linked to the First Response Fund. That's also been approved by the Gavi board. So we had those resources available, and as the fake was declared, and that triggered, the teams internally to build out a proposal to procure, again, still at that point subject to pre-qualification, because unlike Murat's point to PAHO, Gavi still requires either pre-qualified or emergency use listing from WHO for us to procure. But we built out towards the expectation that that was coming. And, a month post the fake, pre-qualification was declared by the WHO. At the same week, we were able to also sign an APA deal and be ready to procure doses, secured funds for procuring 500K in doses. So, that's, I think, a really critical piece, a critical contribution. At the same time, we were looking at how do we use mechanisms internal to Gavi to support countries. We declared our own type of emergency declaration, which allows countries to look at potential opportunities to reprogram funds that are in country, but also made them then eligible as doses became available to tap into some first response funds for delivery support. So we've been actively pursuing those channels of country support, as well as making doses available, working closely with partners, as I say, initially, really following the strategies developed by Africa CDC and the WHO. You had asked beforehand to think through a challenge, and I would say, and Murat alluded to this one as well in his comments about indemnity and liability, and your comments also around sort of the issue of label. As we all know, children is still an off-label use, at least for the Bavarian Nordic product. And for us as Gavi, again, we rely on the WHO for the regulatory, but also for guidance to countries to help inform policy development. And SAGE has come out already in August in support of vaccinating children with Bavarian Nordic, but acknowledge that it's not yet pre-qualified, and there's also not yet emergency listing for under 12s, which makes it an off-label use and a decision that countries need to take. And one of the tools Murat inferred was a no-fault compensation mechanism that existed under COVID. Those types of tools, and how do we think about and anticipate some of these short-term, hopefully, liability issues and funding capacity resources, I think is really critical. Some have been looking at it, but I think it's still a gap that's holding up access for children. So I'll stop there, but I think that from my standpoint, there was a very rapid learning benefit. I guess it was kind of a perk from COVID, where we were able to kind of set up donation agreements with the US and Canada and others, sort of take steps pretty quickly. But we continue to really rely on this infrastructure of regulatory and legal, and those require different types of partnerships, but also just different institutional decisions.
Before moving on, I'll just ask if you would like the opportunity to expand. You mentioned, I'd love to hear your perspective of the regional role, you know, your learning of that component of it, since you mentioned.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. As I say, we have been working closely with, there's been a infrastructure startup called the Access and Affordability Mechanism, but it's being actively led with WHO Global, but also Africa CDC. And as everyone knows, the public health emergency of continental security was declared actually a day ahead of the FAQ. A lot of initiative by the Africa CDC to really build out its strategy and provide direct support. And they're now being a joint IMST between the WHO and Africa CDC. And again, really working as a global entity, learning how to work through regional implementation processes and adapting, in some cases, our own approaches such that we can be more supportive of regional solutions, but also working through regions to get to countries. And so that's, again, an ongoing lesson that I think is really critical, but served as important here. Thanks.
Can I ask one question before we move on? Can you just explain, do the products have to be PQ'd for you to purchase, or like for this instance, Bavarian Nordic was already an approved product, so could you not already just purchase that because it was approved, or do you need the PQ?
So we need emergency use listing or PQ from WHO to procure. We can help support and facilitate donations that have an SRA approval, provided the country also in turn has that their national regulatory authority approves. And so we were in a position to help start to coordinate donations if requested for support from donors, but our ability to actually procure doses is still triggered by a WHO regulatory decision.
Are you thinking about changing that at all? Could be helpful. So, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And I just want to also pick up on your point about the integral tie between the liability risk management challenges and the regulatory challenges. And the legal preparedness action package has even a separate, this is the regulatory subworking group, and that's our focus on this conversation. But there is a liability subworking group as well that has done similar webinars and equally focused on those challenges, and really advocating for countries to think ahead about those types of risk management approaches, because they truly are some of the barriers that have recurred at every single public health emergency, managing the indemnification issues, as well as you mentioned, no-fault compensation mechanism, and trying to tackle how to approach those issues. So I just wanted to follow up to make sure that's another conversation. As Deb mentioned, these are just ongoing conversations. That's when we also anticipate having additional conversations about, and the subworking group is actually working on a guidance and tool to facilitate some of those education efforts.
That's great. Super. Yeah, I think that kind of anticipating that and working that through would be super helpful. So appreciate it.
We'll look to you for additional support on that one. Okay, I'm going to now thank Dr. Hacker, if you would like to go next and just offer some of your reflections and perspective on this effort. Thank you.
And thanks ever so much for inviting me on to talk a little bit about this from CEPI's perspective. So I head up the regulatory team at CEPI. And primarily, CEPI is a funder. And in fact, we've looked at data gaps for MPOX, and we're funding a household transmission study and also a pediatric study, which I think will be very important in extending the indication for the Bavarian Nordic vaccine. But we're also a facilitator and have a lot of conversations with regulators around the world and other bodies to really try to understand what the issues are, what the sticking points are. And really a lot of our role over the last couple of years around MPOX has been doing exactly that. So I think I started getting very concerned way back in the first MPOX outbreak. It was very clear that the countries where we were seeing a lot of MSM transmission were having mechanisms that could provide access. We saw the approvals in Europe, in the US, in Canada, in UK, in Switzerland, etc. We just heard excellently from Murat about the PAHO mechanism. What a wonderful opportunity. It doesn't need, there has to be a need which can be triggered by PAHO. It doesn't need anything else apart from potentially the US FDA approval or European approval. And then they can start to give access to their member countries through this. And from our observation, we obviously do a lot of work in Africa, is that there's a whole range of countries who don't have an access mechanisms under these circumstances. The disease is essentially endemic in many of the countries. Bavarian Nordic is such a small outfit, they're not going to make individual regulatory submissions to those countries. And in some cases, the countries don't necessarily look at it as a priority anyway, because there are a lot of issues, medical issues, which need to be looked at and prioritized: malaria, and dengue and other diseases which are really taking priority. And therefore, those countries actually need help sometimes to move their regulatory needle forward and to make sure vaccines are going to become available to them, often via donations from Gavi and other governments as well. But you ended up in a situation during that first fake where those countries had no access. Bavarian Nordic wasn't going to make the submission. And I think that was where we wanted to get involved, CEPI, to start to talk to some of the regulators and talk to the WHO to get a deeper understanding of what the requirements would look like for a PQ mechanism, an EUL mechanism, or some kind of submission to take place. And indeed, we started those conversations. What was increasingly concerning as I had those conversations with various folks is that the understanding behind why EMA, and I'm sure Marco will talk about it, approved the vaccine, both for smallpox and for mpox, and similar decisions being taken by other regulators, was poorly understood. It's actually written up very clearly in the assessment reports. But one could argue it's not a conventional package. There's not a formalized vaccine efficacy study out there which can point to exactly the efficacy of the vaccine, although effectiveness data started to emerge from the first fake. And so we started to think this is extremely important and really laid out all the data for the two vaccines, the candidate vaccines at that time, the Bavarian Nordic vaccine, MVA, and the LC16 vaccine from Japan, and really tried to articulate what the data said very, very clearly, what the regulatory decisions were which were being taken, cross-referencing to the decision documents that the regulators made, US, Europe, etc. And also then leaning into the public health recommendations being made in these countries. In fact, you don't see, despite there being no label for under 18s have access in many countries in Europe and in the US. And the reason for that is the EUA mechanism in the US, public health recommendations in certain European countries that recognize that there was, albeit no data specifically or very limited data specifically with the MVA-BN vaccine, but because the MVA backbone had been used in other areas, notably in Ebola, that there was sufficient data in children that it could be administered in these circumstances. EUA mechanism, the US allowed that, public health recommendations, other country then allowed that. So we laid out a lot of this data in a document and distributed it to many parties. We had discussions with AVREF, with Kwasniaka, as we've just heard from, and indeed have provided to the Southeast Asian regulatory network as well for their use as appropriate. And this was all before the PQ came through. And I think it proved to be a very important document in helping many countries get a understanding of what the data looked like and realization that there was substantial data to demonstrate that these vaccines were going to be safe and effective. So that's really important. I think through those discussions which we had and through developing that document, we could identify the data gaps very clearly. Pediatric use, very important, something which we could go ahead and fund. But we also saw that there were sticking points. In the absence of a PQ mechanism, there was no vaccine being procured. And that speaks to what Hannah was just talking about a minute ago. In fact, if there is a mechanism to trigger procurement, even off the back of a stringent approval, I mean, it wasn't going to be long before something else happened after that first fake, and there would be a continued need in many parts of Africa. But the absence of a PQ meant that that purchasing wasn't ongoing. Now, you can say that once that happened, it happened very quickly and purchasing occurred. But of course, over that 1 or 2 year interval between the two fakes, or the slight overlap, I suppose, supply could have been and manufacturing could have been initiated if there was a demand. So do you think that discussion needs to occur as to when can the earliest point of demand be triggered, even if there's not a PQ, so that vaccine, there is a purchaser somewhere, and that purchasing can then trigger manufacturing and supply? Because if that had happened a year or two ago, I guess we would be sitting wishful thinking on another 10 million doses or something sitting out there. So it's important to reflect on. It's not a criticism. It's just saying that mechanisms could evolve and we could be more prepared, I suppose. There are also other couple of things going on there as well. I talked about the pediatric use, really important to think about that. But who is prepared above the agencies who have the mechanisms in place to really focus in on that emergency use, like the US, like public health recommendations? There is a desperate need in children. How do we help those decisions being taken in other countries, as in African countries, which I think is very Q or a WHO or AUL mechanism. The indemnity and liability issue became very apparent. I think it was good that Bavarian Nordic, to a certain extent, waived for on-label use the indemnity and liability. So then even if, I suppose, interesting question, would that be granted in the context of a country EUL mechanism? Would there be an indemnity and liability managed through that mechanism? And somebody else can probably comment more. Pediatrics, that becomes a problem. And also when you move off-label into intradermal use, that becomes a problem. And again, data became available over the last couple of years, which highlighted that, particularly in the US under the EUL mechanism, that intradermal administration could allow a dose-sparing regimen, particularly important when there's a shortage of supply as we have. A fifth of a dose could be used for intradermal administration. That option is not available in countries who aren't prepared to take that risk of giving it an EUL or finding another mechanism to use it. And even more so, because you're off-label, indemnity and liability issues occur. And also many of the agreements for supply agreements may be originally provided through the donations, so they're relying on the supply agreement to the original donor country. Those clauses in those contracts don't allow off-label use. So a country has to be prepared to break those contractual obligations, which in some cases we've seen, certainly for COVID, some countries were prepared to do that. But you have to be a brave country to do that. So I think there are a lot of things going on in what I'm saying here is that there are opportunities ahead of us if we can set something up, and I don't know what that looks like. A lot of very clever people around the table here to think about these things. How do we get earlier access? How do we get earlier demand and purchase? How do we enable off-label use? How do we manage indemnity and liability issues to be managed? And I think these are all things we can look forward to the future, using MPOX as a case study about how I think we've done well, but we could certainly do better. And I'll stop there.
I think that was really great to summarize some of the initial framing of challenges and pinch points that highlight the overlap that we were hearing, that really it's very difficult to just isolate regulatory challenges, and that's how we sort of approach this conversation in some ways. And it creates a bit of a challenge in that they really are integrated with all the larger legal challenges that you've identified, the liability challenges, the contractual challenges, the incentives that are needed to even do the manufacturing at the outset prior to the BQ, the tie to the FIIC, which really at the outset, that's a pinch point that we really need to focus in on. And I do think this is a lot of where we want to capture these clear pinch points and start to drill down and understand what can the global community do. We have a lot of players, and like you said, smart people here at the table, meetings, at the Africa CDC last week. I think that we can make a lot of progress moving forward. So thank you for those remarks. Deb, did you have any questions at this point before we move on to Marco?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. And now I would like to turn to Marco Cavalieri from the EMA. And I guess I would like, just again, as all the speakers would like to just hear your perspective as the reference authority for much of the vaccine work that has been enabling us to get to where we are today, and some of the pinch points from a regulatory perspective. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I will build on what Adam has already said, that I think, described very well all the issues. But looking into what happened and what is the lesson learned, I have to say that similarly, we saw, the number of cases increasing in Africa and the DRC at the end of last year and beginning of the new one, and nothing was happening. WHO was not taking any action. There was no willingness of going into any pre-qualification, and countries affected were not taking any action as well. And what was fascinating, and for me, maybe is one of the points that I would really like to remark here, is that, when I started ask why vaccine is not available in the DRC, why, there is no access to Imvanex at all. And I was told, people said, well, is not approved, and therefore, it does not make any sense to try to purchase it or to, procure, donate, and whatever. And at the same time, the others were saying, well, there is no donation, no vaccine available, so why should we approve it? So there was this type of vicious circle going on that, really was a terrible deadlock. And nothing was really happening, taking into account these two principles. So that's why what we did, because indeed, as Adam stated, EMA, but many other agencies in the Northern Hemisphere went straight away into approving Imvanex for MPOX when he arrived in 2022, without hesitation, explaining the benefit risk and explaining the consideration of why we went into this approval. Of course, it's a bit of an atypical approval, no doubt about that, but we felt very much comfortable and secure about that decision and the fact that the benefit risk was established. So we wanted to explore how we could support WHO and African countries, in helping them to take a decision. And that's what we did also with our really good collaboration with AVRF, and I know Kwasi is here online, which has been instrumental, to increase the chances that we have a continuous dialogue with different national regulatory agencies in Africa, but also directly with the DRC. And that's why, I went to Kinshasa at the beginning of April to really talk to them and to understand what is the issue. Why is it not possible to get this vaccine approved, or at least, getting an emergency use authorization, considering, the spread that at that point in time was really increasing massively and really showed that there was a huge problem there. So, everybody was a bit in this deadlock that people did not want to take responsibility of a decision, didn't know where to go. WHO did not take any decision on pre-qualification or, recognizing that there was an emergency going on there. And this, of course, has contributed to all this hesitation. And so we tried our best to convince authorities that in terms of giving at least an emergency use authorization, that would have been perfectly fine, and there were good regulatory basis for doing so. And so we used the very well established mechanism of reliance. So sharing our assessment report, talking to the regulators in the DRC and other countries in case they have questions, to explain where we were coming from, why we felt this was important, and why we felt this could be done. And we were very happy to see that DRC took a decision even before WHO, for example, on the emergency use authorization. That is something that I think we need to think more in the future, how the regulatory community at the global level can work more together to support each other and to make sure that regulators then can take difficult decisions with not alone, but with the support of a broad range of different authorities across the world. I think this is in the common interest, and this will be allowing these very important aspect that often the lack of a regulatory decision is the reason for inequity in access to medicines. We are seeing here with MPOX, but I have also dramatic cases in the context of antibiotics for AMR, also in other continents than Africa. And so we need to do more here to help regulators in taking rapid decisions. And of course, the other important element is that somebody has to make an application, because without an application, regulators cannot take a decision. So this has to all work together with the funding side, donation, but also a sponsor that submit an application for regulatory approval, and then the regulatory agency working with the international regulatory community, regional, and even more broader than regional, to discuss and to take a decision on giving at least an emergency use authorization. So we achieved that, at least in the DRC, rapidly. But of course, it was not enough. And that's why we also use other international tools that we have, such as the ICMRA, which is the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities. And we had really a good workshop not long ago that I co-chaired together with Professor Adeyeye from Nigeria, with the many regulators from all over the world there, and all agreeing on importance of making sure that the vaccines for MPOX get rapidly approved in different parts of the world. We also discussed all the issues with therapeutics. That is not for today, but I can tell you that also is quite a challenge. We all agree that we need to use more this reliance mechanism to allow countries to come up very rapidly with a decision, so that as this is the first step from when all the decision on procurement, on liability, and all other expert donation will come in. Without this starting point, nothing will happen. And so it's so important that we all think about the importance of this step. And now we mentioned children, and this is still a problem, as also Adam said. And I'm glad to tell you, and now I'm looking more into a prospective time of consideration, is that today came out on the EMA website a recommendation from the Emergency Task Force that the vaccine Imvanex can be used below 12 years of age in case of an emergency and in case there is a need. And we did this because we think that this type of recommendation can help national regulatory authorities in taking actions. And therefore, now this is out. It's not an emergency use authorization because, first of all, we don't have yet one in Europe. We will have it in the future, but not for now. But also because, we don't have an emergency in Europe. So we have to think this more in terms of helping other regions and preparedness for the continent. And this was the basis of our decision, but really helping other regions was the primary goal of our recommendation. So what we need to do now is to take this document and see how this can really help in practice, advancing decision in countries on the use of this vaccine. And that's why we see two options: either individual countries straight away, such as DRC, take a decision on their own motion to give an emergency use authorization also in children below 12 years of age, or WHO decide to give a UL for use below 12 years of age. And it will be interesting to see which one will come first and which one will be the most effective route. But I can tell you that since next Monday, I will be talking to WHO SAGE, for example, to see what we can do and how to work with all the players in Africa, DRC authorities, but also AVRF, African CDC, to see how we can take it from there and make sure that, you know, this becomes reality where actually is needed and where it can have an impact, which is to start with in the DRC. And I really hope that this will work out, because indeed, giving an emergency use authorization in country will solve all these issues around liability, and probably will be an appropriate way forward, you know, to allow use in a population that is among the target group for vaccination at the moment, at least in that country. Adam also spoke about the intradermal administration. We have been supporting that as well when MPOX came to Europe in 2022. And I do believe that that is a fantastic strategy for dose sparing. It's safe, it's effective, and I don't understand why it's not fully considered. Fully recognize that this is off-label use, and it will remain off-label use because the company is not interested to get an approval for that type of administration. But nevertheless, it's in the common interest, is in the public health interest to make sure that we could also use that route in case there is shortage of vaccines, and we want to make it efficient with our vaccination campaigns and make sure that they have an impact. So here, it's a matter of working with Gavi, with countries, to understand how we can overcome all the issues around liability for such a use, which I believe will be in the interest of people affected. I will stop here, happy to take any question.
Thank you so much for that. That was really helpful to see how you've been focused on the international response from where you sit. And one of the things you mentioned, which I think FDA as well is very involved in trying to address these, what you described is this network of global regulators. How do we tackle some of these issues to help countries through the work with ICMRA, through some of these, regulatory harmonization for devices, it's through IMDRF. There are these regulatory networks, and where we sit within the Legal Preparedness Action Package, it's a unique organization as well with this regulatory sub-working group, where we can bring resources to help also think through some of the global mechanisms, some of the leadership challenge, decision-making, regulatory decision-making, structural challenges that you've described. And, just even some of the basic mechanisms that enable you to do the technical assistance work that you do in terms of sharing your assessments. It has to be in accordance with, from FDA, in accordance with our laws. And then we have to have bilateral mechanisms in place to allow that type of sharing, to think through some of those aspects of this complex situation. We, welcome, again, this is the first of a lot of conversations, but really helping to more think through, might there be room for a growing network parallel and has a little different focus, et cetera, with some of the work that is truly the leadership work through ICMRA and things like that. So if you have any reflections on that concept.
No, yeah, I think, we need to build on all the different tools that we have. ICMRA is one of those. It's been extremely successful during COVID-19. If you remember, one of the key agreements on the study design for vaccine for COVID-19 came through ICMRA. That was really a milestone. But we should not forget that ICMRA is still a club. There are regulatory agencies from all continents in the world, but it's not inclusive of all regulatory agencies in Africa, Asia, or South America even. So we need to think about using ICMRA as one option, but not as the only one. And that's why, also in the work that we'll be doing with WHO, particularly on clinical trials, we think that it would be very important to create regional hubs of regulators that can come together, and this will facilitate conversation across regions and also on a global scale. Because as you can imagine, one of the issues that often we've been discussing, you cannot have a regulatory meeting with more than 100 regulatory agencies online, or at the meeting. It will not be efficient. It's not going to work. So we need to create an infrastructure that is efficient in allowing that decision-making grows in certain areas. And then, this area can have a continuous dialogue with different areas using the concept of the regional hubs, because I cannot think of anything else that is better placed than that in allowing, these cross-fertilization and, discussion across agencies all over the world. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of agencies wanted to have bilateral discussion with us, which sometimes we did, but again, there is a limit to what we can do. So we really need to think about creating an infrastructure that would make this type of dialogue across hundreds of regulatory agencies in an efficient way, but also being able to reach them all. There are many agencies that often are not brought up in discussion, not at WHO, not at ICMRA, and we should not miss them. Those countries should not be left out. We need to be inclusive and need to think about a system that will work. So ICMRA is a tool, but it's not enough, and we need to build something that is really more is capillary and able to reach out to all the agencies in the world. And for me, the concept of the hubs such as AVAREF, PAHO, EMA itself is an hub of regulatory agencies, probably is the best option.
Well, there, I feel like you've given us marching orders. This is great. We really would love to work toward that vision that you're describing. I think it's really super. So, Deb, did you have any additional comments for this panel?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I think this was a great capture of some of the lessons learned so far. So, a lot to think of, a lot to chew on, a lot to build on. I think we want to pull together additional conversations building on some of the themes that you have nicely framed for us. So I think we're just about on time with our schedule, surprisingly, because I haven't really looked at the clock, to move to the industry perspectives. And we are very fortunate today to have Phyllis Arthur from Bio join us and Christopher Adero from Roche Diagnostics. And so we really haven't had much conversation so far with regard to the diagnostics landscape, which has also been an area where expansion of the laboratory networks, surveillance, et cetera. So I guess first starting, we'll keep the conversation going in the vaccine space since we've built up so many themes and ideas. And I'll introduce Phyllis Arthur from Bio. And same question, really. I mean, you sit at the hub of some of these issues with maybe, I know you're not with, Bavarian Nordic, which has been one of the key vaccines at play in this whole response. But given your role with Bio, just share what perspectives you may have from where you are. And again, appreciate I know you're very busy and just came back from travel, so appreciate your attendance.
Thanks so much, Liz. Hello, everyone. Sorry I sound a little rough. I came back from Europe with a bit of a head cold, but I'm really glad to be here. Actually, it's been an extraordinarily engaging conversation over this meeting, and I agree with a lot of what was said. From an industry perspective, we actually care greatly about the power of what regulatory harmonization could do for more rapid access to medical countermeasures. I think what I heard from Murat and Kwasi and others in particular was, one, completely agree with PAHO that routine immunization is the crux of pandemic response. And so being good at and having the health systems that actually facilitate the use and access of routine immunizations is what allows us to surge when we need to, when we have a FAIC or a pandemic emergency of some kind. So really was glad to hear that link between pandemic preparedness and routine vaccination in country. I think the other thing that I heard that really reflects the position of industry is the power and importance of actually doing the PQ process between the FAICs. I think Adam Hackler actually said this, and then Dr. Cavallari said this as well. So in my discussions with Bavarian Nordic, I think as a small to mid-sized company that really was extraordinarily interested, actually very committed to getting this product to as many people as they could, there was a lot of frustration with not being able to get moving on the pre-qualification process. Between the two outbreaks, they actually submitted their pre-qualification filing. They tried to deliver all the data they could. They knew PQ was important for having the conversations with Gavi about procurement. They knew that PQ would facilitate the conversations with governments in different countries around their own regulatory review. And particularly for a small mid-sized company like Bavarian Nordic, this ability to normally leverage both FDA approval, EMA approval, and possibly PQ would have allowed them to go more quickly in getting product to more countries. And I think it's important to note what I think Dr. Cavallari said, which is that regulatory process is the kickoff for donations, contracts, procurement, liability, and industry actually stands ready to make sure that they have supplied as much data as they can. I think what's unusual about medical countermeasures, which I think Genios, that's what we call in the US, is a perfect example of a product that's been for many decades approved for more of an emergency use of a biothreat, and then obviously segues into this use for an emerging infectious disease like MPOX. But the process in the US and the EMA is more clear for going from the kinds of studies you do for a biothreat to the kind of studies you do for an emergency use for an emerging infectious disease. And so leveraging, unfortunately, the outbreaks to actually gather that final efficacy and safety data, and then really turning that into full approval is a system that we should try to duplicate around the world, because we will have more of these unfortunate emerging infectious disease experiences where maybe a product has one indication for one particular part of the viral family, but actually could be used rapidly to assess its impact on a different but related part of that viral family. And that requires the ability to have EUA, PQ, really good clinical trials designed with the sponsor in the room. The sponsor actually understands how their product works, has really good scientists thinking about all the different ways that you could actually have really good endpoints that help alleviate an outbreak. So how much can we actually work together in those breaks between outbreaks to actually make sure we're ready for the next one with approvals, with clinical trial protocols already set up? Industry definitely stands ready to be a part of those conversations with WHO, with Africa CDC, with CEPI, with BARDA, with ASPR, with FDA and EMA. So I think we would really like to see us leverage these times in between to actually have more products fully approved and ready to be used worldwide when needed. Thank you for the opportunity to join you.
Thank you so much. And just before I know we're going to have a robust conversation on diagnostics, but just from what would be the most impactful action or activity that could advance some of the harmonization that underpins a lot of what you are describing?
I think that actually having the pre-qualification process have the urgency that it should have. So my understanding is that it was slow getting WHO to be interested in working with Bavarian Nordic on the pre-qualification for the product while there was this lull in cases. And so you had this time where the filing and the dossier were in for a while. Then suddenly we had increase in cases, as was discussed, and suddenly there was this urgency to get it done. We have to actually keep that urgency for getting that done while there's no cases, because we knew that we were going to have, unfortunately, more outbreaks. Now that we have MPOX, we have MPOX. And so how do we take advantage of that and keep that urgency going when there aren't cases? We can't take our eye off that ball. The company was ready to do all the different studies Deborah Esky mentioned, or I think actually Adam mentioned the adolescent study. The company is passionately willing to do the work, the companies, right? They need the support of the regulators to keep that urgency going, because otherwise companies that really have only a few products to sell are floundering, waiting for that a regulatory approval that really drives the ability to have demand, whether that's donations or contracts with Gavi, et cetera. So I really think it's about the urgency of getting these medical countermeasures over the finish line that actually will allow access.
Thank you so much for that perspective. And now I feel like we need to have a conversation around the looked or under discussed aspects of this response that have been the diagnostics. So I will first just ask the same. You've heard now the entire conversation, Dr. Odero from Roche. If you, just your perspectives on what have been some of the legal and, you know, with a focus on regulatory, but just general legal challenges toward getting the laboratory expansion of testing to inform the surveillance work that's going on, to inform the contact tracing, to really have a robust response if from the beginning. So I'll just turn it to you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you get me well?
I can hear
Okay.
you.
Yeah, so for me, I think in terms of the legal challenge for diagnostics, I think the greatest challenge lies in the vast diversity of the legal and regulatory requirements across the countries for the same product. And I'm speaking from a diagnostics perspective. I recognize that the discussions beforehand have largely focused on around the pharma issues, vaccines. And when we look at the vast diversity of legal and regulatory requirements across these countries, they result in the need for unique dossiers and redundant testings and reviews. And the solution for this is to harmonize the requirements by establishing a single high standard for product quality and safety. And I think that that standard should be grounded on international norms. This approach would allow for the jurisdictions to rely on the regulatory decisions of others, as well as enabling access to the product maybe 2 to 4 years earlier than it would have been required. Again, diagnostics have very unique challenges from pharma products, and I think there's need to take this into consideration. And I'll just piggyback on what the World Health Assembly resolution on diagnostics called out for a few years ago. And that was a vital step towards recognizing diagnostics as essential for health services, and also to advocate for regional implementation to make diagnostics accessible, especially in under resource settings. And that resolution emphasized the need to harmonize regulations across, especially for us in these resource constrained settings like the African countries. And this will help to streamline approval processes, enhance preparedness, as well as reduce barriers to accessing those diagnostics. With regards to the specific challenges that have been faced with the MPOX response, I think the barriers that have been encountered mainly have been with regards to deploying MPOX diagnostics, such as, again, similar to what you've been discussing earlier on, prolonged assessment and approval times, and also the absence of unified regulatory reliance frameworks that have, these have affected greatly the timely response across Africa. And if we're able to adopt and rely on that World Health Assembly resolution, then we know that the future responses to public health emergencies can be supported by promoting policy alignments across the regions and also encouraging frameworks that better support public health priorities. Yeah, I can also reflect a bit on the industry perspective on the diagnostics from a public health emergencies perspective. And we know that the diagnostics industry plays a crucial role in developing and deploying these innovative solutions. And they emphasize the need for adaptable and harmonized regulatory frameworks, which support very fast or swift approvals and broad accessibility. And from the industry perspective, we are faced with unique difficulties for navigating these fragmented regulations across the borders. And this adds more pressure to meeting various national requirements and simultaneously. And using regulatory reliance, which have been talked about, the pharma vaccines team have talked ably about using reliance models. We also advocate for this from a diagnostics perspective. They can aid African countries to expedite the authorization of diagnostics by leveraging decisions from trusted reference authorities. And this could also enhance preparedness for public health emergencies. And again, the World Health Assembly resolution has underscored the need for regulatory capacity strengthening and suggesting that regional harmonization initiatives, such as the one we have in Africa led by the African Medicine Agency, could play a pivotal role in advancing diagnostic success during public health emergencies. And to ensure that effective solutions it is essential for organizations like AMA to align in the design of regulatory frameworks that are tailored specifically for medical devices and IVDs, separate from the pathways that have been established for vaccines and medicines. And too often we see that reliance pathways fail because they attempt to adapt medicine-based approaches to medical devices and diagnostics regulations, which result in ineffective oversight. Therefore, even as organizations like AMA coming up and doing this harmonization and convergence work, they should prioritize involving the diagnostics regulatory and industry experts from the very beginning to ensure that these reliance frameworks that are being built and nuanced have nuanced understanding of the medical devices and diagnostics requirement. And this will prevent the misalignment that occurs when vaccines and medicines focused professionals attempt to retrofit these frameworks and enabling a truly robust and responsive regulatory environment for diagnostics. Back to you.
Interesting. The couple of themes I'm hearing. I mean, you're echoing some of the themes within the other conversations. Question regarding how the World Health Organization's EUL listings have changed when that occurred. Is that something you see as did that change the conversation once that happened? Did that, or kind of speak a little bit to that?
So we know that WHO, for example, has called for manufacturers to list their products, diagnostic products, through the WHO process. But we still see, we've seen a similar process led by the AU NEPAD through that's the precursor for the AMA African Medicines Agency, also being requiring a similar effort. And they rely, there's an assumption that the reliance will take place for between the WHO listing and what the Africa-led process will be assessing and making recommendations on. But we know that these are also taking time. So for example, the call from the African continental effort has been there for close to 2 months now. And still what they've done up to this point is just to acknowledge the expression of interest. And now they're calling for specific manufacturers to submit dossiers. It's taking quite a bit of time. And even when you talk about effectiveness of reliance mechanisms in the face of these time-constrained decisions that are required in the face of public health emergencies, then I don't think that is efficient enough. So we still call for regulators to practice recognition in the face of, using the already established reference agencies like what WHO has already done. It's gone through a rigorous process, and that should be relied upon by the African authorities to enable that these products get as quick as possible to use as required. So we know that jurisdictions should avoid retesting products already approved for sale by reference agencies, and these jurisdictions should have emergency use pathways that recognize the recognition that, like I've already mentioned. In addition, outside of the emergencies, again, these jurisdictions should allow for the least, for at least a bridged assessment that leverages the decisions that have been made by reference agencies to avoid redundant testing of IVDs, because these processes take time, and the process at the WHO listing in itself was quite a rigorous one, and should be trusted because it's a reference agency. So there is no need to repeat these testings through these redundant processes that take quite a bit of time. And in order to ensure that regulations are developed well, they need to be independent from what is being done for medicines and vaccines, where diagnostics regulations cannot be just retrofitted onto the pharma regulations, and we need to have the diagnostics experts on the table when these are being done, or when the assessments are being done. So there's call for implementing strategies that will be able to fast-track approvals through regulatory reliance, and also increase public-private collaboration to make these diagnostics more accessible during these public health emergencies.
Thank you so much for that. I think that this weren't, the issues, and I'm glad you brought the themes, are the same across all medical countermeasures, but I think the issues related to diagnostics are sufficiently different that I do think that we need to have conversations that are parallel, similar to what I think we heard from Marco and Adam regarding the global landscape of national regulators to consider similar. I know IMDRF, there are groups that are similarly in the device and diagnostic space, having those similar harmonization and coordination. And I think this warrants yet again another conversation more focused on the vaccine issues as well, because yes, they overlap, they're similar, but they're also unique in many ways. So I appreciate that insight, and I think this is the beginning of a dialogue that we need to really advance further. So with that, I think we have time. Yeah, we still have about 10 minutes for opening up questions to people participating here. And so welcome. How to receive them, through the chat, or?
I think through the chat, I mean, I can't see hands, but I did ask if anyone has questions to drop them in the chat just like a minute or two ago.
Okay.
And even if you don't have any questions now, but if you go away and think of the questions, if you get them back to the GHSA website, I think it goes to Kat anyway, and then she can filter them back to us.
I'll just throw out to the panel generally.
There you go.
Having heard this conversation today, and I think this webinar was really, really very helpful. And Deb mentioned that we're working on an issue brief to kind of identify and those key topics that we've talked around. If you guys just can reflect on what you think would be most helpful for us to focus on in terms of the type of guidance work, the type of tools that would be the educational tools that would most help the countries. I'll just throw that out there, given that, and waiting for maybe other question to come in.
see a question from Anna to everyone. So I don't know who would like to respond.
Was the world better, less, or equally prepared from a regulatory legal perspective from MPOX versus COVID? Did we get better? Did we get worse? Adam, I see you went off mute.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. And of course, it depends when you decide that this whole issue arose, which was, as far as, you know, I tried to allude to in the comments I made, was a number of years earlier. And one has to say, you know, as I indicated, the Northern Hemisphere countries took decisions very, very quickly to protect their populations. And I think it comes down to what the priorities are in other countries. It's not a criticism, but there are a lot of priorities in many countries, which are very low incomes, from other diseases, from wars, etc. And I think that's where a number of speakers have talked to mechanisms that can help building trust between the regulators so that they can rely more heavily on each other's decisions. CEPI's all about preparedness, and you know, being prepared says that you've got vaccines available, you've got the regulatory approvals available for when they're actually needed. My frustrations, I think it's fair to say, with where the time course is really that there was no reason, with all the approvals in place, and as somebody else indicated, actually the regulator, the meeting we had in Kinshasa, that, you know, a lot of us talked that the lowest hanging fruit is the regulatory approval. It should be a very, very straightforward thing to have achieved, and we were pleased that in DRC that they took that decision to issue the emergency license. It's after you've got that approval that the huge complexity in a country like DRC then follows, and they have been challenged to get the donations, to get them imported, to get them distributed, to identify the patient populations to be dosed. Those all then flow. For COVID, it was much more straightforward, one may argue. You know, it was a global pandemic. It had the global attention. The EUL mechanism kicked in extremely fast from the WHO, and was tremendously successful in all of the countries providing that access, because it was viewed as a global issue which they had to sign up to. So future epidemics, future pandemics, you know, the epidemics are always going to be in these situations. There are a cluster of countries, often in regions that have relatively limited regulatory capabilities. And we would absolutely advocate for the partnerships, which we've just talked about, to be up and running so that we can really move these things forward much faster.
Phyllis, I saw you went off mute and went back on. So
Actually, because Autumn said a lot of what I was thinking. In the end, I think that the regulatory processes are so complicated for a regular immunization, where I'm going from country to country with my regulatory filing. How can we help make sure that countries leverage the tools literally meant to speed the regulatory process? And I think that several of the tools that I've mentioned on this particular webinar really could be used better, utilized better. So I saw someone in the chat said it's better than it was before COVID, but there's still things to fix. I think that we learned some lessons from COVID, but again, I don't know that we applied the same urgency to other particular diseases that we could have in between COVID. You know, we had some pandemic fatigue worldwide, and I think people just wanted to get back to regular business. But I think there's a subset of us on this call who need to always have our eye focused on the next coming emergency. We don't have to ask that of everybody worldwide, but there's a subset of people that just need to always have that urgency and that readiness as part of their DNA and as part of their thought process. And I think that probably got a little lost in the COVID fall off. And now we to some degree still had to scramble, when I don't think we actually needed to scramble if we'd done a few of those things we learned from COVID in that interim period.
So I now we're getting a lot of questions, and we're a little short on time. We have a question about those of you, and for those of you involved in negotiating funding agreements, how can they ensure access agreements which would support timely regulatory filings toward approvals? And I think that ties with the last question about what extent indemnity liability is a hurdle to being able to make donated vaccines available. It gets to the negotiating the contract. So I'll
I'll just make a small, I won't necessarily talk about access of approved vaccines because it would be lovely to if there was free reign for them to be used off label and decisions could be taken. I'll leave that for the others to comment. But one of the most important things we saw it with COVID and certainly with MPOX is those vaccines being available for clinical research. They have to be made available. And the contracts prevented that. And we saw with COVID, we were desperate to do immunocomparisons between different vaccines, and it was impossible because we couldn't get access to them, and the companies wouldn't allow that. So I really think where donations are occurring, there have to be clauses in those contracts. I can understand the companies ring fencing their sales, et cetera. But for clinical research, the field has to continue to move forward, and that cannot. I really think strongly that should not be blocked by the contracts.
And in this case, I guess the question also about liability, I think it's the same. It's tied in certain respects. But does somebody want to add response to that component?
We need a mechanism for indemnity and liability, and there's no question about that. I don't know whether that means that the purchasing price, which is taken by whoever the purchaser is, includes a percentage markup to have additional insurance on top of it. I mean, there must be mechanisms that at least take some of the pain away from the real complexity of getting that indemnity and liability sorted out.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we have received so much information to chew on, and we really want to work with everybody here that was involved in this conversation. I think I'm hearing a focus on clinical trial infrastructure, which is an area that I think we really haven't focused on, that I think is tied into this entire conversation. Regulatory harmonization, the different groups that are involved with that, the reliance agreements, and how we can serve as a forum for educating on emergency access mechanisms and provide that network for people to really come together for best practices in that regard. So with that, I think we just want to thank everybody for participating today, and really, really appreciate the value that you bring in sharing these perspectives. You know, Deb, I don't know, it was you've mentioned now that we will continue to have additional meetings, so
put us on the hook. No, and again, you know, unfortunately we didn't have Africa CDC. I can't imagine, you know, just they're consumed with what's going on with all the donations that they're giving, and they're allocating vaccine across the continent or country. So, I mean, I think there's a lot here, and we know it. We do know it, and some of us live it. And so I think it's really important to you know, pick away at what we heard today, summarize it, send it out, and then start pulling at those threads and seeing when we can get all of the requisite stakeholders around the table for the next discussion. WHO is missing, you know, and Africa CDC and some of the key countries. So we do have that follow-on conversation and engagement. It's not just the conversation, it's the engagement piece. So don't hide from us when we come looking for you.
That's right. Answer our phone calls, answer Deb's phone calls, and also follow us by visiting the website, our website, and LinkedIn, which is in the chat. I think it was in the chat before. Maybe they'll put it in the chat again, but contact Catherine Ginsbach at the email that is available to you. So with that, we appreciate your work. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.